So before I get too much into the video, I want to take a minute and break down what a turn 2 deck is. A turn 2 deck is basically just what it sounds like. It's a deck that's based around a Pokemon with the idea of having that Pokemon attack on the second turn of the game at the absolute latest. So starting off here, it's going to be a strong stage 1 EX. Typically, it's going to be a strong stage 1 EX Pokemon. It's going to have the ability to attack on turn 2. Now, the attack it can do on turn 2 might not be its strongest attack, but it has that ability to put instant pressure on the opponent really, really quickly. It's got to be strong enough to close out games. So typically when you're playing a turn 2 style deck, you have a very strong and aggressive early game. And the trade-off for that is typically your deck is probably not going to be as strong as slower setup decks in the later stages of the game. So you've got to have a turn 2 style deck has to be one where you can put that early pressure on the opponent, take quick, easy prizes, but you still have enough strength in that Pokemon that you're able to close out those games against stronger, slower setup decks. Typically, it has some sort of a disruptive ability or a disruptive attack. This is either going to be through a power, a body, something with the attack that messes with the opponent's Pokemon really well. Just something that is disruptive. And then lastly, it meshes well with the format. It's got to be something where you're not taking a big loss to something in the format. You don't have a very common weakness in the format. Just something where it meshes well with the top decks in the format. All right, so since we kind of wrapped up or gave a brief introduction into what a turn 2 style deck is, let's just go ahead and jump right into the video. One last thing that I wanted to mention before we jump into the video is that turn 2 style decks are great for beginners and more experienced players alike. They are pretty simple to pick up, understand the basic concepts, and then play at a pretty competitive level for newer players, while at the same time, there's enough player growth in the decks that it will appeal to more competitive and more seasoned players at the exact same time. So if you're somebody new that would like to start playing EXL or would like to jump in on one of the Sunday tournaments, but you're not very familiar with the format or decks from this time period, turn 2 style decks, especially like the Arcanine EX deck that we're going to talk about today, are a great starting point for you, and hopefully will remove some of that difficulty in learning the format. Hey everybody, this week we're going to be taking a look at a turn 2 Arcanine EX deck in the RS to PK format. So jumping on into the deck here, we play 4 copies of Growlithe. I went with the Body Slam Growlithe. Not only does it hit for 10 damage on the first turn of the game, it also gives us a 50-50 shot at paralysis. If we can get a special condition on the opponent on the first turn of the game, that sets us up really well for a turn 2 Arcanine EX. Next up, we play Arcanine EX. Arcanine EX does a little bit of everything right. It's a stage 1 Pokemon EX, has 120 hit points. It hits for 2 energy, you can do 30, and then 20 damage to one of your opponent's bench Pokemon. So essentially for 2 energy, you're going to be hitting for 50 damage, hopefully on the second turn of the game. And then its second attack, for 2 fire energy and a colorless energy, you hit for 100. And then you can either discard 2 fire energy or 1 react energy. Most of the time that we're using Flame Swirl, we're going to have a react energy on it. So essentially we're going to be doing 100 damage and discarding only 1 energy. One of the things that really drew me to playing Arcanine EX is its Pokebot or Fire Remedy. So whenever you attach a fire energy to it, you heal 10 damage and all special conditions. In the RS to PK format, the format is just filled with special conditions. In particular, one of the most annoying cards that sees a lot of play is Stantler, which will do 10 damage and automatically confuse an involved Pokemon. So just having that ability to not only heal that 10 damage, which can really mess with some of the opponent's math, but it also gives you the ability to remove all special conditions. Just all of these things combined make Arcanine EX the perfect turn 2 deck. Next up, we play 1 copy of Houndour, 1 copy of Houndoom. I play this as a safeguard counter. It's not a perfect safeguard counter. You're not going to be able to force yourself through multiple copies of Ninetales or Dustox EX. But in certain matchups, say Arcanine EX, for example, when they just run a single safeguard counter, it does give you a way to play around it that the deck otherwise would not have. I also like Houndoom because of the Lonesome Pokebody. If you have fewer Pokemon in play than your opponent cannot play any item cards from their hand. Essentially, in a turn 2 style deck, you are typically going to have a smaller bench than your opponent. I will say in actual testing and actual playing, it's a little bit harder to get off than you might assume. But as far as something that's kind of a pseudo safeguard counter, yet pseudo useful in about every matchup, Houndoom just kind of fits the bill better than most other 1/1 stage 1 lines. Next up, we play 1 copy of Lunatone, 1 copy of Solrock. The idea behind the Lunatone Solrock combo is that we're going to be able to shut off Pidgeot, Porygon 2, and then other random things, Macargo, my Delta Milotic, and I've even run into a couple Blaziken matchups where it'll shut off the Ruby Sapphire's Blaziken. Now, moving into the trainer lineup here, we do play the Holon Engine. We play 4 copies of Holon Transceiver, 2 copies of Holon Mentor, 1 copy of Holon Adventurer, 1 copy of Holon Scientist, and then what I would call the MVP of the deck, 1 copy of Holon Lass. Now, I do want to note here, we only play 2 copies of Holon Mentor, just because once you get the first one off, that's basically all you need for the game. Essentially, you're hoping to open Growlithe, and then on that first Mentor, you can grab your Lunatone Solrock combo if you need it for the matchup. You can grab your Houndour, you can grab a second, third Growlithe, but essentially once you get that first Holon Mentor off, you should pretty much be set for the rest of the game. And I've even considered dropping down to just 1 Holon Mentor, but out of fear of prizing the single copy, it scared me away from that. Holon Adventurer and Holon Scientist, they give us a little bit of utility and straight draw in the deck. Holon Lass, and the reason that I call it the MVP of the deck, is in any sort of turn 2 style deck, it is so important to be able to hit your energy drops every single turn, especially in that the first 5 turns of the game I feel are absolutely crucial. And if you miss an energy drop at any point in those first 5 turns, your odds of winning that game drop dramatically. And then in the later stages of the game, it becomes incredibly important to be able to find energy when you need it. And Holon Lass fits the bill. In the early stages of the game, it should have let us look for at 10 to 12 cards, and then in the later stages of the game, off a late game admin or something like that, it should still let us look at hopefully somewhere between 4 to 6 cards, and just ensure that we are able to hit those energy drops. Next up, I play 4 copies of Curse Stone. I like Curse Stone a lot in this deck because it combos really well with Overrun, and nearly every single deck in the format is playing some sort of Pokepower. Being able to combo it with that Overrun lets us set up knockouts on the bench that might otherwise be out of reach for us. I think you can make a strong argument to play Crystal Beach in this deck, but I find that Curse Stone is a very active stadium, where Crystal Beach is a very reactive stadium. And in such an aggressive deck as Arcanine EX, I would rather have the more proactive and more aggressive Curse Stone. Depending on how you build the list, I think you can also make some arguments to maybe play like 3 Curse Stone, 2 Crystal Beach, 3 Beach, 2 Stone, something like that. But when you're trying to focus on consistency and a very linear game plan, I think just going the Curse Stone route is going to be your best approach. Next up, we play 4 copies of Energy Removal 2. In a turn 2 style deck, the first 5 turns of the game are absolutely huge. And when you're trying to put so much pressure on your opponent to just overwhelm them at the start of the game, all of your opponent's energy drops are going to be so crucial for them. And being able to discard one of their energies in the early game, or in the later stages of the game, being able to remove a Scramble energy or a Double Rainbow energy, some sort of strong special energy can really, really set your opponent back. The way that I like to view this, especially in a turn 2 style deck, is 1 energy removal 2 heads. So removing an energy is essentially 1 turn, or it should set your opponent back ideally 1 turn. So when you're putting that much pressure on your opponent that quickly, being able to set them back 1 turn, 2 turns, 3 turns in the early stages of the game is going to be absolutely devastating for him. Next up, I play 4 copies of Rocket's Admin. Now, Rocket's Admin might seem a little bit out of place in a turn 2 style deck, especially since we are trying to go up on prizes very quickly. But one of the things that I found with the deck is that you're going to put that first Arcanine EX and you're just going to start trying to overwhelm the opponent. They're going to put all their energy and everything they can muster into combating that first Arcanine EX. And if they do eventually succeed in knocking that first Arcanine EX out, you're going to be able to admin them down to 4 cards, ideally bring up a second Arcanine EX, and then knock out whatever their big threat is that they just put all that effort into. So essentially, you're going to be leaving them with 4 cards and a considerably worse board state than they had before. Next up, we play 3 copies of Mary's Request. Since we don't play any Stage 2 Pokemon in the deck, it's just going to be a straight draw, 3 cards. Next up, we play 3 copies of Professor Elm's Training Method. Professor Elm's Training Method lets us search out the Arcanine EX and helps ensure that we get it on the second turn of the game. Between 3 Professor Elms and 4 Arcanine EXs, we have a total of 7 outs in the deck to hit that turn 2 Arcanine EX. Next up, 2 Steven's Advice. Steven's Advice is just a great draw card. A lot of the time in the format, decks like to play with big benches, so usually with Steven's Advice, I net somewhere between 4 and 6 cards. Next up, I play 2 copies of Warp Point. Now, I play Warp Point in the deck because for a couple of different reasons. One, since you're going up in prizes very quickly, I've noticed that the deck can be weak to POW hand extension, and I'll have a lot of times where opponents will try to POW up something on the bench like a Lunatone or a Soul Rock to try to buy themselves some more time, or to set me back an energy drop to have to retreat that Pokemon. Warp Point lets me just switch the Arcanine EX back into the active spot. The other thing Warp Point does is I've noticed that on occasion I'll be really close to knocking something out, but I'll come up just 10 or 20 damage shy of it. In those sort of situations, I can Warp Point that Pokemon back to the bench, force my opponent to bring something else up they maybe don't want to, and then overrun to knock out whatever is on the bench that has that 10 or 20 HP left. And then lastly, with Warp Point in general, sometimes you can just force your opponent to bring up something that they don't want to bring up, or something they're not ready to bring up yet, and get a knockout on it before they get any sort of real value out of the Pokemon. Next up, I play 1 copy of Scott. Scott is just a great utility card in general. Essentially, I play the 1 copy because I want to be able to search out my 4 Cursed Stone, or search out multiple Cursed Stones just to ensure that I have it turn after turn. It's also good to basically search out any supporter that you might need for the situation. In the deck, we play a wide range of supporters, so being able to have that utility is very helpful. Grab your Professor Elm's Training Method early in the game in case you weren't able to find the Arcanine EX. Grab your Hold 'em Last if you're running low on energy in your hand. Rocket's Admin if you know you're going to have to put your opponent at a small hand size. Mary's or Stevens for draw. Just any of those situations, Scott just lets you choose whatever you need out of your deck to fit the situation you're currently in. Lastly, I play 12 Fire Energy, 4 React Energy. Like we talked about earlier in the video, it is so important for a turn 2 style deck to be able to hit those energy drops consistently, especially in the first 5 turns of the game, and then be able to find that energy when they need it later on in the game. I have played around with a lot of different numbers in a turn 2 style deck, and I have found 16 is just that perfect number where I'm able to consistently see energy turn after turn. That wraps up our look at a turn 2 Arcanine EX deck. If you enjoyed the video and found this information helpful and you want to see more content like this in the future, please like and subscribe to the channel. It helps me out a lot, and I really appreciate it.